Good morning. Happy Friday. People have been bugging me to talk about this Colorado qualified immunity. Colorado's removed qualified immunity from the police. Well, I have been hesitant to do so because, number one, I don't really care about Colorado, and number two, qualified immunity is a federal idea. It's a federal defense, essentially. I want to remind everybody what qualified immunity is before I start talking about what Colorado did, which they call qualified immunity, but it's really not. What qualified immunity is essentially a special motion to dismiss. That's essentially what it is. In it, if a defendant in a civil action, remember this is civil, I know a lot of people keep thinking this applies to criminal cases, but it doesn't. In a civil action, if a defendant asserts qualified immunity, then the plaintiff would have to show that whatever it was that they're accusing the defendant of doing is clearly established in that particular circuit as a right, as a violation of someone's rights. And if they can show that it in that circuit is a clearly established violation of rights, then they get through the qualified immunity. If they can't, well, then generally speaking, the case against that defendant gets dismissed. The court may or may not go on at that point to determine whether or not it should be a violation of rights. The court may go on to establish it as a clearly defined violation of rights. So that's what qualified immunity is. Only applies to federal, and it is essentially a defense, a special defense, a motion to dismiss. Now, what did Colorado have before they passed this bill? What they had before they passed this bill was a requirement that the government indemnify employees. The employees wouldn't have to pay whatever judgment was against them. The state would pick up the tab unless the plaintiff could prove that what the employees did was wanton and willful and wanton. The employee had to intend to do it and had to be essentially reckless as to whether or not what they were doing was the right thing or not. So wanton, the plaintiff would have to prove in order to get any of the defendant's money, and not the state's money, but the defendant's money, they would have to prove that whatever the defendant did was wanton and willful. It was a wanton and willful violation of whatever common law right or what have you. Because remember, this is Colorado's state law. So if you sued for 1983 in Colorado, you could actually sue in the state court, but the defendant would then just remove it to federal court and assert qualified immunity, because 1983 is a federal law, and the defendant always has the right to remove a federal question to federal court. Federal laws are federal questions, so they get to go to federal court. They don't have to stay in state court. They can if they want to, but they don't have to. So, generally speaking, that would only apply, that indemnification, which is not an immunity, but that indemnification would only apply to state laws. And it applied to all state laws. So what changed? Well, the qualified immunity, in air quotes, portion of the Colorado bill Well, the bill does a lot of things. It requires the police to wear cameras and not mess with the film, blah, blah, blah. But the qualified immunity portion, which people have been asking me to talk about, it creates a new cause of action, which is essentially a 1983 lawsuit style cause of action, except it's for violations of Article 2 of the Colorado Constitution. Violations of Article 2 of the Colorado Constitution. Article 2 contains a lot of things in it, but you don't have to really worry about most of them. Basically, it comes down to don't violate people's Fourth Amendment rights. I know Fourth Amendment is federal, but that's really what you're looking at because it only applies, this new cause of action only applies to peace officers. So basically you could sue a cop for a violation of Article 2 of the Colorado Constitution under this new cause of action. And under this new cause of action, nowhere else, but under this specific new cause of action, qualified immunity, as Colorado has defined it, doesn't apply. But what does apply? Well, the state will still indemnify. It's basically like your insurance company stepping in and taking care of the defense and paying the costs associated with judgment and everything like that. Unless the plaintiff, I'm assuming the plaintiff, I don't really know who has the burden of proof on this one, but I'm going to assume it's the plaintiff. Unless the plaintiff can prove that the individual, the person defendant, did not have or did not act reasonably and in good faith. And at that point, then the defendant can be liable for up to $25,000 or 5% of the judgment, whichever is greater. So think of it as a $25,000 cap. So under the old system, if you sue for anything except for this one special cause of action, the state will pay for everything for the defendant unless you can prove the defendant acted willfully and wantonly. Under the new indemnification for this specific cause of action, the state will pay for everything except for $25,000 if you can prove that the person did not act reasonably or in good faith. Reasonably or in good faith. I don't want to go through sprinklers. It's warm, but it's not that warm. So you could see that it may in fact apply or afford more, I guess, insurance indemnification to the officer than under existing state law. It may actually give them more protection because if the plaintiff could prove that the cop acted wantonly and willfully in violation of whatever statute or right, the plaintiff could be on the hook for the whole thing. The whole enchilada. Now unless the plaintiff unless the defendant committed a crime and has been convicted of a crime on it, then there's a $25,000 cap, and that's only if you could prove that the defendant acted unreasonably or in bad faith. So it is not a big deal. It's not really a game changer at all. I suppose that unreasonable or in bad faith is easier to prove than intentional, which is willful, and wanton, which is essentially reckless disregard to whether or not you'd be violating your rights. I guess it'd be easier to prove unreasonable or bad faith. So it might be a little easier to get $25,000, but You know, I'm not entirely sure of that. It's not a huge game changer. The thing with bills and acts and laws like this is you can't just read the title. They call them different things, and they say different things than what is actually in the bill. Like the Clean Air, I don't remember what it was, but like George Bush called it like the Clean Air Act, which relaxed regulations for pollutants. It made it so companies could pollute more. The Clean Air Act made it so companies can pollute more. The Affirmative Action Act in California repealed a section of the California Constitution that required the state to not discriminate based on race. I mean, you can't just go by the title. You got to actually read it. As far as qualified immunity goes, again, I still think that it is necessary. Simply because even in the Colorado bill, there's a fee shifting deal. Like if the plaintiff can show that, if the plaintiff prevails, essentially, then they can get their fees and costs paid, their attorney fees and their court costs paid. And if the defendant prevails, if they can show that it was a frivolous action, then the defendant gets their fees and costs paid. Except here's the problem. The state can always afford to pay the fees and costs. Cops at least have jobs, so they could probably afford to pay some of them, or maybe take out a second mortgage on the house or something like that and pay the fees and costs. But the plaintiffs may not. The plaintiffs may not have two nickels to rub together, in which case they're going to be essentially judgment proof on that, and they're never going to pay the fees and costs. And if you try to go after them, they'll just declare bankruptcy or hide their assets or whatever. Maybe they don't even make enough to garnish their wages, etc. Anyway, it's just not that really that big of a deal. I'm kind of rambling now. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.